I consider a special session on the official title is Children Have Spiritual Lives Too, Exploring the Way Children Connect in Their World. This is something I've been wanting to do for a long time, and we're very fortunate to have joining us tonight Amanda Borchik, who's a pediatric chaplain and a researcher, who will share with us how she came to do this work and some of what she has been learning with children and families, and also two moms, Jeanette and Robin, who will share with us what they learned and believe and saw in their sons, Frankie and David. Sorry, Robin, David. Really, this topic is very important generally because at the end of the day, what is actually more important for us as human beings than our inner essence, which is what I think of when I think of spirituality. And I know that for myself, Dr. Laura Basili, who's a pediatric psychologist, she's on this call, she's joining us tonight, and she worked with my husband and me during our daughter Cameron from diagnosis onwards, and she herself is a very spiritual being, but she reminded Charlie and me of that we are spiritual beings and that we could tap into the spiritual essence of our daughter Cameron, who was only 6 months when she was diagnosed and could never communicate in a typical traditional way because she was so little, and then her disease took away so much, so that by the time she died at the age of only 2, we were feeling and seeing her spiritual essence in ways that were special to us. And I want to thank Laura for helping us do that work. So we always felt connected to the spiritual life of our daughter, and in fact, it informed some of our decision making. So this is an important topic for myself. So thank you for showing up. And without further ado, we'll quickly, if you could please, if you are not averse to showing yourself, we do like to see your faces, and turn off your mic, put questions into the chat, and then when we open it up, we may open it up for you to ask directly and not just put questions in the chat, but for now, we'll be using the chat because of the number of people that we are. We did get some questions ahead of time, which we'll make sure to address by the end of the hour together, so rest assured about that. And again, unless you're eating chow mein and noodles are coming out of your mouth, we probably would like to see your face. That has happened on a Zoom with me, and I do not recommend that. Okay, Amanda, if we could begin with you, and then Robin, and then Jeanette.
Sure thing. I'm Amanda Borchik. I'm a pediatric chaplain and a researcher of spiritual care, and also a new PhD student in educational psychology. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, where it snowed a little bit today, which was super crazy. It shouldn't be that cold here, but it is. And I am originally from North Carolina, which is where I fell in love when I was training at Duke Hospital, with working with children who were processing what the end of their life might look like, who had big questions, and there was very little space around to hold them. So I became very curious about how we create those kinds of spaces, what it takes for us as clinicians and providers to do that, how families can teach us how to do that better, how children themselves can teach us how to do that better, and how we all work together as a team in supporting the spirituality of children. I've learned so much, and it's helped me even find so much of my own spirituality. So I'm really grateful to be here, and honestly, more than anything, grateful to share the space with two incredible parents who are going to teach with me tonight.
My name is Robin Kanarek. I'm a registered nurse. I've been a nurse for 47 years, and prior to my son's diagnosis, I dealt with medical chronic conditions. But my son was diagnosed in 95 and died in 2000 after a very complex stem cell transplant. And after I went through grieving, I decided to start a family foundation, highlighting the psychosocial and spiritual needs, which I don't feel our son received. Palliative care wasn't a subspecialty at that point. So that really hindered us. And through that, I got very involved with Fairfield University. And eventually, 2 years ago, I published a book with Johns Hopkins entitled Living Well with a Serious Illness. So thank you so
Which
much
I
for including
recommend.
me.
And Robin, you should say, David had cancer.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Yes, David
yes.
had leukemia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Blythe.
Yeah. And Jeanette?
Hi, my name is Jeanette Vigorito. I reside in Reading, Massachusetts. I'm an attorney by trade, a mom of two boys, one living. His name was Frankie. He passed away 3 years ago. He had a genetic condition that he was literally the only one in the world with. So it was a complex medical care that I learned along the way. I'm a fierce advocate by life circumstances, which frankly has been my role of a lifetime, to be the parent of a child of special needs that was medically complex for 21 years. Spiritually, I hadn't thought about that until Blythe reached out and said, what do you think about your spirituality between you and Frankie, or Frankie's and myself? And when we sort of went back and forth, I recognized that looking back, I learned all my spirituality in life because of Frankie. He taught me how to be patient. He taught me how to listen. He taught me how to understand. And quite frankly, he turned me into a person that no is not a word in my dictionary or vocabulary, because everything that I did was always a yes for Frankie. So that has been the role of my lifetime, despite everything else I have done in my life.
And you've both done a lot. And yes, I think what you both are naming is the extent to which our the privilege and challenges, any privilege and challenge brings us in touch with parts of ourselves, but also when you are doing this as a parent and are being called to be the best parent possible and to honor and deliver love and beautiful care, it means seeing into all of your child, some of which is more easier to see than other parts. The spiritual parts are hard to see because it's the inner. And also some children, like my daughter Cameron, could never communicate it in an obvious way, whereas David, I know, was ultimately let you know, Robin, that he was struggling. So there are scales here. All right, I'm going to drive this deck while Amanda talks.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Blythe. And thanks to Robin and Jeanette for joining me tonight. You'll notice that we've started by already beginning to cast a little bit of vision of what we're going to be talking about. So this is not necessarily a conversation about religion tonight. This is a conversation about the larger umbrella that religious or faith belief fits under, which is spirituality. So there'll be times when we talk about faith, but I want to cast just a bigger umbrella, wider net for us to begin from tonight. And also you'll notice too that, what we've been talking about so far in the stories that you've heard is beginning to notice and explore the way children connect in their world, that children have spiritual lives too. And the goal of this time together is not to learn how to teach children to have a spiritual life or to somehow give them something in that way, but to discover what is already there. And I loved, I think Blythe used the word hidden, which is a really beautiful way of describing it. I was reading a beautiful interview earlier today with Rebecca Nye, who I'll talk a little bit about. She said that being with a child's spirituality is a little bit like playing hide and seek. It's this gift of discovery, of finding and noticing and looking and being observant. So I hope you will join me in listening and observing and noticing within yourself now too. You can go to the next slide. Just a quick framing for the evidence for today's discussion. This field is about as old as I am. So you'll notice as I talk, I was born in 1985. This field began really in the 1990s. Some of the research began a little prior to that, but it's not very old. Maybe that's me hanging on to my youth here. But This is a field that's emerging, a lot of qualitative research, and I'll be intentional to describe and to tell you where the research is coming from as I go. We don't use this to diagnose or to make any kind of treatment recommendations that nothing that's rigid in that sense. So if you have any questions about any of this, don't hesitate to reach out, but just want to be clear about where we're coming from. And of course, it's your opportunity to listen to what I'm sharing, maybe to wrestle with some of it, not agree with all of it, to find your own path with it, maybe to use it to engage curiously with questions as you reflect on it yourself. All right, next. And so we'll describe childhood spirituality. What is that big thing? How do we begin to put words around it? Identify ways in which children may express that kind of spirituality, and explore practical ways, both as parents and providers, that we can support the inner spiritual life of children. Next. So the beginning of this story really centers around a little girl named Ruby Bridges. And as Ruby Bridges was integrating an elementary school alone, often surrounded by adults and in a pretty volatile environment, there was a young psychiatrist, this is in the 1960s, driving to work one day. His name was Robert Coles, and as he drove through New Orleans, on his way into the city, he was blocked by a crowd, and he noticed Ruby. He started following her story and learning more about her, and he was incredibly curious about her courage. How is it that she could do this very hard thing every day? And so he spent time interviewing Ruby, caring for her family as a psychiatrist, offering his services and care. And over time, they developed a friendship. He wrote books about her. They presented together as adults later in her life. But Coles really began to ask questions that no one in the field of psychology was asking at that point. It had been pretty taboo to ask about spirituality or religion or faith. It was just something you really didn't touch from that point of view. And so we really didn't know much about it, and especially not about how children might express those things. We really valued how adults used words, and intelligent and smart words, to express those kinds of things the way they are expected to be expressed. So Coles looked back over his notes from interviews with children, and he began to notice the depth of the spirituality of the children he had talked to. So then he spent countless hours interviewing more children from different countries and cultures to begin to understand and see a universality around spirituality for children, that there was some qualities that were shared. And then some researchers in the UK in the 90s, after Coles published his work, Rebecca Nye and David Hay, and you'll hear Rebecca Nye's name throughout. She's an incredible child psychologist who's really driven a lot of the research forward in this area. They began to study and sit with young children and ask them questions to discover just everyday life, what their experiences were, what was special, what was meaningful to them, and what stood out to them. And so one way Rebecca, after being with many children in this way, invites us to contemplate what child spirituality might be, or how we might begin to describe it. She says it's hard to define, but describe it, is the next slide. If you'll go to that, Blythe. What are children like? And so I want to invite you to pop into the chat now one word that describes a child. Maybe it's yours, maybe it's a child you were with recently. I'm going to say hilarious, because my 4-year-old daughter was being hilarious earlier. Curious, spunky, creative, wonder. I can't keep up. There's so many. Unfiltered for sure. Trusting, magical. It's one of my favorites. Old souls, spontaneous. I see the word curious so many times, which makes me so happy. Joyous, trusting, stubborn. Yes. Silly, observant, insightful. Awe, yes, they have this ability to be in awe of things. Playful, imaginative, wise, innocent, boundless. Yeah, don't try to pin them down. Resilient, beautiful, wondering, energetic. So as you're describing all of those ways that we see children, those are also the ways we would describe a child's spirituality. Boundless, wild, maybe silly and hilarious sometimes, imaginative, innocent and creative, and deeply curious. If we took every time the word curious was just mentioned and held it in our hands, that would be a really good description of child spirituality. Lots of questions, lots of whys, and lots of wondering about what could be. And so then Nye, for those of us who maybe need a more concrete definition or description, begins to put more words around this for us from her interviews with young children. She says child spirituality is an initially natural capacity, meaning it's something that we're born with. It's innate to who we are. And it's about the awareness of the sacred quality to life experience, that ability children have to notice things that are happening or be in awe or amazed by things that the rest of us maybe miss. This awareness can be both conscious or unconscious, something they're aware they're thinking about or not, and sometimes goes back and forth between both, but in both cases affects actions, feelings, and thoughts. And in childhood, spirituality is especially about being attracted towards being in relationship and connection, responding to a call to relate to more than just me, to others, to something bigger, whether that's God, the divine, an other, a larger feeling or value, to the natural world of creation, and to a deeper inner sense of self. This encounter with transcendence can happen in specific experiences or moments, as well as through imaginative or reflective activity, thoughts, and meaning making. Can sum up that last little bit there to say through play. And there's lots of ways that kids play. So as you think about, we'll go to the next slide, and then we're going to reflect back on this one together through this next question. So usually the way I ask this question, so if it's more helpful, you can think about it this way too. There's two ways to ask this. One is if you think back on your own childhood, just you yourself sitting here. What's one of the first memories you have of something that was just incredibly special and sacred to you? And maybe you want to think about that for a little bit. And what was sacred to your child? What would they share, or what would they have shared was one of the most special and sacred things to them that they remember? Yeah, and you can add those into the chat if you want to share. Mine was often rocking in the rocking chair after getting Wendy's cheeseburgers with my grandmother on Sunday afternoons. I can like feel the velvet of that old rocking chair still in my mind. The beauty of a flower is sacred, time with grandparents, spending time together, watching VeggieTales. That was also my childhood. Catching frogs, reading up in a tree, rocking chair, nursing, reading. My brothers and I would pile on my father's belly while he read to us. I love that. Time with my grandparents at their farm, playing with the dog, time with cousins, fishing with my grandparents. Go back up to the top. I missed a few stories of elders in my family, praying with my parents in the morning, a special prayer, watching airplanes take off and land with my grandparents on Saturday afternoons after church, bedtime stories, my grandparents, playing tag at the playground, waking up to the scent of my mom's perfume, board games, playing the guitar while my mom played the piano. So if you'll go to the next slide, Blythe. So maybe it's not the next slide. One second. Go to the next slide after that for me, and then we'll come back to this one. I'm gonna send Blythe on a slide roller coaster here. If you'll go to the next one for me. Thank you. Sorry, there it is. So you'll notice in those stories, if you go back to the child relational consciousness. Sorry, I noticed okay, great. My internet was being weird. If you think about the stories that were just shared, you'll see they orient around these things that were described in what I read a minute ago. And it's these 4 areas of what Nye would call relational consciousness. And an easier way to think about that, I think simpler language, is the ways we connect in relationship. So whether that's with other people who love us, grandparents, family, friends, for a lot of adolescents and kids in the hospital, it's their football team they miss, it's the soccer team they miss, it's school, my friends at school, or the pool party I was supposed to go to this summer, the child in the world. I think a lot in the hospital about how little access kids have to the outdoor natural world, how limited it is to them. Some of the rooms in my hospital don't even have windows. And many of the offices where providers sit don't have windows. And I find that so interesting when we think about the spiritual connection that we have to the natural world that's outside, the way it grounds us. We talk a lot about just getting out of the building, going outside sometimes. So many of your stories, fishing, being outside, being at the farm, animals. And animals, again, one of those things that are often limited from the hospital space. Child and self. When we think about moments maybe that you had alone, one of my earliest memories is reading the Boxcar Children under the dogwood tree in the yard that I grew up in rural North Carolina. Just this beautiful tree that would drop petals and a bird feeder, the ground covered in birdseed, and I would just read alone, and I was so happy, and it was so special and sacred to me. And then also the way that children connect with maybe something beyond themselves. Maybe that's a sense of just feeling. Sometimes kids will describe feeling something bigger in the room or feeling a love that's hard to describe. It is interesting because in these stories, you'll notice that most of the stories you share, they don't center around maybe a religious place, but they could have content in them that is related to spirituality and faith. And so it's important to remember that those things exist beyond those spaces, that they're not the only place where sacred things happen, that sacredness is happening all around us, specialness, spirituality is a part of all parts of life. And if you'll go back to the slide before for me, Blythe. So one way that we know that children, especially nonverbal children, express the sensitive mode of being is through verbal and vocal expression. And this comes from Elaine Champagne. She's a Canadian researcher in pediatric palliative care and spiritual care. And this is one of the areas that she really focuses in on because she wanted to capture preschool age and younger children who we often miss in this kind of research. And so she says verbally and vocally, screaming, laughing, crying. You can tell what a young child, what a baby needs and how they connect with you from the time they're born. They're meant to attach and they seek us, right? They want to be with us. And so the way we hear them, the way they hear us, the way they turn or maybe notice us, even if they can't turn, but the way they comfort when they know that we're in the room. Through pictures and sculptures or making a drawing or something visual or tactile. And sometimes that's a lovey or some way that a child interacts with something that's beloved to them. Physically and with gestures, running, sitting, moving their hands, the tactile, the kinesthetic. I remember the mom in the hospital whose child was in an accident and whose body and expression changed deeply afterwards. I at times would not be sure what her daughter was feeling because I wasn't around her all the time like she was. She was so in tune with her daughter. And she said, I can tell by the way her eyebrow is moving that she's in pain and frustrated right now. And I know that so many of you relate to that because you know your children so well because you're used to being the one to communicate or advocate on their behalf. You are the one often telling their story. So I'm curious for Jeanette and Robin who are joining us. What were ways that you found your children communicating with their whole body and person? When you think about maybe those pieces of relational connection we just talked about and the ways they connected with the world, or also the way they communicated non-verbally and the ways you picked up on those things. Can you share a little bit about that?
Robin, you want to go first or you want me to go first?
You go first.
Okay. So at the very beginning, Frankie was able to speak, but then as his life progressed, he went into not being able to speak at all. So he couldn't, then he couldn't also see, walk, or talk. But at the beginning of his life, we used to spend a lot of time together doing a lot of his preferred things. And one of the things, it was very tactile. I always like to hold his hands and kind of play with his fingers. And it became a thing that it was comforting. So whenever we went to places later on in life when he couldn't do those things or communicate, when he could, he would grab my hand. And if there was something scary, he would just sort of rub it, or he would just kind of give me a pointed gaze if someone came in the room and said something that didn't agree with him. As he even lost the ability to even move, and it became worse, that he was just sort of laying in bed, not being able to do any of those things. It became more of, and then he couldn't even gaze. It became weirdly more of a feeling. By that point, I had spent for 21, well, he passed away when he was 21, but I spent like 19, 20 years with him. And it literally became a feeling that I would ask the question sort of up into the sky or in front of him. And I would actually give myself, is it a yes? Is it a no? And whatever I answered, I would actually feel pained in my stomach. So it's kind of weird because the doctors at Boston Children's kind of referred it as she is somehow so connected with him that she communicates in a different way altogether. And it also, like, even towards the end of his life when we were in the hospital, I kept feeling they were looking for things. And I was like, that's not where it's at. I kind of feel it, that it's coming from the brain, whatever it is that he's bleeding. And it would like settle. If I was in the right track, my stomach would settle and it would just kind of go back and forth. So I think it became just listening and understanding and sort of putting myself in his shoes and trying to be him. And that sort of kind of created a picture for me.
David was 10 when he was diagnosed with leukemia, and he was in remission for four and a half years. He relapsed, and he, the true essence of who David was manifested through his humor. He had total control over everything through his humor. And that was such an important part of who he was. Even the last words he said before he was intubated was a joke. And so I think that to me was how David was truly himself, especially when he and his father were together. They would just banter one another, and it went way over my head. I mean, I was not a part of this, but it was just an incredible thing to see as to how a child could be so sick. I mean, we would be coming home from Yale, and David would power puke off the highway, and he would say, okay, let's go back to making jokes. And that was who he was. And so humor was very important to David.
I love those stories. Thank you so much for sharing those. I'm going to have some more questions for you in just a minute. Blythe, if you'll go ahead to the slide with the dinosaur on it. So many of these researchers describe a phenomenon, and I think that Jeanette and Robin have begun to speak to this already, and that is that every child has their own spiritual signature, which means that each of you do too, because we were all children once, I believe. Not all children have been adults, but all adults have been children. So this is actually a drawing from my daughter, Lucy. She put that dinosaur and she used her oil pastels, which are really important to her. She loves all mediums of art, and she particularly loves anything that's messy. She does not use crayons. She has never wanted to use crayons her whole life. So far, she just wants to use very fancy art materials that I have like stored away from my days in college that she finds. And so she wrote her name. She's learning to write. I love that she writes the U inside of the L. It's like this special little thing she does, and she'll sign all of her artwork with it. And I was thinking about this conversation about spiritual signatures, because every child is unique. And I asked this question, one of the ways I begin to understand a child or adolescent's spirituality when I meet them is I'll ask a question like, and it depends on the age, but around the lines of, you know, I meet a lot of kids here in the hospital. I wonder, what makes you different from any other kid that I'm ever going to meet here? And the stories that I have heard, one of my favorites is the day that I sat down in an adolescent's room. She had a jar of frozen pickles in front of her. And I can tell you, I've seen some pickles in the hospital. I've never seen them frozen, but she only liked this particular brand, and she had to drive very far to be at the hospital with her family. And she brought her favorite brand of pickles that had to stay refrigerated, and they were frozen and they were thawing so that she could enjoy one in a little bit. And that was one of the things she told me that she loved. And she also told me about her family and the ways in which she loved her nephew, and how people would not understand their bond. It was really special to her, and she felt like God had allowed him to come into her life before she was diagnosed so that she had time with him. I mean, I think about these moments in these stories, the way kids have answered these questions. A 9-year-old who told me that her biggest dream was to be the most famous paleontologist. It was, in fact, her largest lament as she found out that she was dying, with the conversation that we had together, was that she regretted that she wouldn't be able to get her PhD and be this world-renowned paleontologist and scientist in this field, because it meant so much to her. And she had put her hopes and dreams into this way forward in this vision for her life. So I think of all of the ways that kids have dreams of the ways they experience the world. I'm looking at all of the things behind Jeanette right now, and I want her to share about those. And by the way, I would invite you to read Jeanette's son Frankie's obituary online, if that's okay, Jeanette. It is one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. It is a spiritual signature. It describes him in detail, and you would never read another obituary that will be the same as Frankie's, because that's who Frankie was, and they captured it so beautifully and honored and celebrated those parts of who he is, all those ways he connects, right? All those sensitive ways he connected in the world, all of the ways he had relationship and connection with those around him. And so, Jeanette and Robin, I'd love for you to share a little bit about, if you had to sum up, you've talked a little bit about it, but a little more about who your children were and how you would describe their spiritual signature. And maybe some of what you think their earliest memory of something special would be. If you could think back to what they would remember from their earliest parts of life, what would have been so special to them? What can give us some insight into what would be meaningful?
Well, I'll go first. I think looking back, Frankie was always a social butterfly. There was absolutely, like, he always wanted to connect with people in every possible way that he could. He would show up to people. He first started with costumes. He was always dressing up as someone, wanting to be something else. It was really funny. He was very persistent. I recall this time that we went to my parents' house in Florida, and at that point, he was into being a cowboy. And he saw a cowboy store, and the lights were on, but it was closed. And I said, we can't go in there, it's closed. And he was insisting, there's no way, the lights are on. We need to be cowboys today. And he's knocking and knocking, and the lady finally opens the door, and she says, we're closing. He goes, oh, no, you're not. Your lights are on. And she was like, well, okay, well, my manager always says to shut them off. I guess I am open. So she brought him in, and he literally bought everything from top to bottom. And she said that was the best sale she had that day. She hadn't sold as much as that, literally everything. And all I could think of back is how persistent he was about whatever he wanted to do that would make him funny, silly, something that he would put on himself in order to be able to go up to people and communicate with them. Because I think he caught on early on that if he was dressed up as something that was completely unusual, out of the norm, people would come up to him and talk to him. And I think he really loved connecting with people. But he also was very strict about who was who in the order, in the pecking order, because we have a close family friend that he said, well, I'll see you later, brother. And he was like, no, you're not my brother. You're my friend. You're not only Alex is my brother. And he was very specific about that. And the guy's trying to tell him it's an expression. He didn't care. He was very literal in his thing. So he was very solid, but he was also very open and welcoming and wanted to have everybody around him.
David was born an old man. Even at the age of 2, he just had an old soul about him. He had a deep understanding about life and was analytical. He got that from his father, really good with numbers. But the one thing that struck me about David was how kind he was. I used to take him to nursing homes and put him on, we would visit the dementia unit, and he would sit on the patient's laps. This is when he was about 3 or 4. And he just had a deep sense of wanting to connect with them. And it was just a remarkable thing to see. He was not, I wouldn't say we're not a religious family, we're not an observant family, but we certainly we're Jewish, and we had, the one thing he loved was the Friday night dinners and just being a family. And my husband would travel a lot. And so when Joe was home, that was very special to David. And that is what David really wanted to grab onto, is the family unit.
The really beautiful stories to describe at the core of who your children were and who they grew to be. And I love also hearing Jeanette about the ways in which after Frankie was no longer able to verbally advocate for himself, you held on to those pieces of who he was, that persistence. You knew those parts of him. And I love, Robin, hearing about that ritual. So rituals don't have to be religious, right? We often think of ritual as only belonging to religion, but rituals are very spiritual, and they also support mental health. There's some good research out there about ritual. And that Friday night dinner of being together, that relationship and connection, you can always depend on. This will be the moment when we're together. There's gifts in hearing those stories, so thank you. So you'll go to the next slide for me, Blythe. So, and I'm seeing all of your comments in the chat and trying not to be distracted because I want to talk about all of those. So we will, I'll catch up on all of those in a minute. I've got a couple more slides, and then we can have some larger conversation. But one of the ways that we see spirituality expressed by children and adolescents is when existential, or what we might call spiritual distress, there's a lot of language around this, concerns, difficulty is encountered, right? A lot of you are parenting children who are up against a lot of barriers, a lot of difficulty, a lot of challenges. I think, Robin, of hearing about how David relapsed, those moments are really hard for a kid to process but I thought I was better, and I thought I did the work to be, like, I went through all the hard things to get to this point. Why are we here again? Or for some kids to ask, why will I always be sick? Will it always be this way? Or to be separated from someone they love for a procedure or something that has to happen where that's needed. There's just all of these really difficult, hard moments. And one way we frame that in pediatric spiritual care is in talking about existential limits. And this framework of existential limits comes from existential psychology from Yalom in the 1980s. And we've done some work in a textbook that's coming out next year to really begin to piece together some of the more recent research we've seen. There's some studies in the UK. You'll notice almost everything I've mentioned is from the UK. Very little research happening in the US on child spirituality. So if anyone's interested in funding that, I would love to help you make that happen, because there's really important work to be done here in the US too, to understand. But there's funding for it. And so that's where we have this research from. But Lucy Coombs and her co-authors, they've published several papers, and they've captured these stories qualitatively. They've told the stories, and they've given us a window into the experience. In this case, we've got some young early adolescents that we've captured some quotes from. And so we looked at their article, we looked at some of these stories coming out in the research and said, how are they illustrating what we would call existential limits? These things that we bump up against. And when we bump up against them, whether adults or children, when we bump up against them, it can create fear and anxiety and what we call spiritual distress. And so the first one we'll talk about is death. Death is a pretty obvious one, right? It's this very, very hard to understand thing. It's a thing that is so complicated and taboo that some people don't even use the word death or dying. I would recommend using that language, by the way. But it's really hard to use that language. Sometimes we try to soften the blow and say things like passing away or going to a better place. And so you think about that alone. That's why we're kind of this death illiterate or avoidant culture in many ways. But death is hard. It's something that we do alone. Even if people are around us, it's something the person dying experiences by themselves. They're the only one that is physically dying. And so it has isolation built into it and unknown. And so a 13-year-old with cancer describes this. They haven't told me after the year. They don't know if I'm going to live, or everyone knows what's the other. They've said they can only tell what is going to happen now. So you hear that uncertainty and what that might feel like. And some of you know that because you've lived that kind of uncertainty too, or living it now. Aloneness, isolation, and I'll share in just a minute, but aloneness and isolation, in the most recent research that we have with the most direct engagement with children and families, tells us that this is huge, particularly for families with children in palliative care and children who are hospitalized. They feel very isolated because they feel like they cannot share their story with anyone, their feelings and story with people. They don't want to burden anyone, even people they love. So a 15-year-old with cancer tells us, I don't always talk to mom. I don't like talking to her because I don't like making people upset or anything like that of how I am feeling. And then freedom. Freedom is complicated because sometimes you have freedom, but you don't really have a choice. Depends on how your immune system is, where you're at in your treatment. What is your grief like today? What's your anxiety like? There's so many things baked into freedom. And freedom has risk attached to it. And so we see freedom has risk attached to it. And so we see a 14. Get that. Okay. And so we see a 14-year-old with a congenital condition saying, I can't do as much as other people. I can't go out as often. You know, I can't go and hang out with friends or go to the town because I get worn out quickly. And if something was to happen to me, no one would know what to do. And then finally, with meaning making, meaninglessness is one of the worst feelings that any of us encounter. It's like, why? It's where the question of why comes from. Why is this happening? And there's often not an answer to that question. I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned as a chaplain, there's probably a top 3 list of things I've learned, and one of them is to not answer that question for someone. That is a question of a deeply personal lament that can only be answered or not answered by the person asking it. A 15-year-old with a metabolic condition said, just remember that even if I have this disease, I want to live my life normally, that normal life that kids just want, and it will get better. I mean, the treatments have already started, so now I will have even more energy, and I'm looking forward to just enjoying what is coming, wanting to have a life that's full of people and love and fun and all the things that make life meaningful and help us be a kid or a teenager. So Jeanette and Robin, I'm curious to hear from either of you. Robin, I know you have some examples. Did you ever sense your child bumping up against one of these existential limits, and what was that like?
I think after David had his stem cell transplant, he was placed in strict isolation. And it was very difficult because he was alone a lot. I mean, if my husband or I weren't there, he was alone. And anyone who went into the room had to wash their hands, gown up, and wear booties and a mask. And it was very isolating for him. And 1 week after he was in strict isolation, he started having changes in his personality. He was a really sweet, kind boy. And all of a sudden he became confrontational with us, with the staff. He would yell at us. He was belligerent. He was having difficulty sleeping. And I kept talking to the staff. You know, and this is 1999, 2000. And I kept talking to the staff about what I saw. And no one, they said, we've seen this in transplant patients, but no one took it a step further. And I asked for a child psychiatrist to go in and to see him because I didn't think David wanted to share his deep feelings with me because I came from the generation of Kubler-Ross, where children don't want to burden, especially teenagers, don't want to burden their parents. So they don't want to talk to their parents about difficult conversations. So I asked the psychiatrist to come in, and the psychiatrist used a very Freudian approach, and my son fired him the next day. And so I was just trying to find someone to really connect with him. And there really wasn't anybody. So finally, I asked one of his favorite doctors who came in, and I said, you have to go in and talk to him. You owe this to David. And this doctor, this is before Vital Talk, and this doctor I really put him on the spot. And he was very uncomfortable, but he went in. 3 hours later, he came out and he said, your son had a lot of philosophical questions about life. And that's all he said. And he walked away. And my husband and I go into the room, and I am just anticipating that David's going to be so depressed after this conversation. And lo and behold, it was just the opposite. I walked into the room, and if I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have believed it. I walked into the room, and David was smiling, and he said, let's play a game. I mean, I couldn't believe it. It was like this burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and he really needed to just vent. And this is one of the reasons why I went into palliative care, because it's that the art of listening and validating what you're hearing from the child that is so crucial. And David really didn't have that. And so after David died, we moved to London, and that's when I got involved with an organization called the Teenage Cancer Trust. And that's when I learned about what were the gaps in his care. And palliative care would have answered a big portion of that.
It's really helpful, Robin. Jeanette, I'm going to save you for the next question, if that's okay, because Robin spoke to something, and I know we're running close on time. If you'll go to the next slide, Blythe. So I mentioned a minute ago that there is a recent study, was published this year by Brian E. Beresford, a social scientist in the UK. It was funded by the NHS, their version of the NIH in some way, not exactly comparable, but close enough. And they did interviews with ages 12 and up. It's a huge study. It's all open access. You can read it if you're curious, called the SPARK study. And they identified threats to children and adolescents' spiritual well-being. And these included struggling to make sense and find meaning in their situation, their existing belief systems or personal philosophies feeling insufficient, existential worries and concerns, like those existential limits we just talked about, a sense of disconnectedness from others in normal life, and a lack of pleasure or joy, moral distress, or feelings of insignificance and invisibility. Almost all described hiding their spiritual distress from others and themselves. At the same time, parents and young people both spoke of wishing for people on whom they could unburden themselves, either at critical moments or to journey with them. For some, chaplains had provided this care and support. So what kind of conditions could have supported children and their families, prevented distress, and created a space of trust from the kind of unburdening these researchers described? So Rebecca Nye, a child psychologist I've mentioned a few times, recommends this helpful acronym of SPIRIT. And I'm going to quickly just overview this for you. There's some questions at the end here that are particularly self-reflection questions for providers. I think these are questions also parents can use, or you can create sort of an interpretation of them that works for you and fits for you. But this was written for providers specifically. And so the first is this consideration of space. What is the condition of the space that we're in, whether that's a clinic or a hospital room, or maybe it's a space at school that's adapted or not adapted appropriately? What's the physical, emotional, auditory, all the senses, how are they being activated in this space? And so considering that is deeply important. I know there's a question coming up. I will go ahead. I hope it's okay, Blythe, that I mention it. I know there's a question someone submitted ahead of time, and I think there's a couple of how do we ask children about these things that are important to them. And I think what I would like to say to that is that before you can ask anything, these conditions have to be in place, or at least you have to be working towards them, or in child or adolescent have to know that you're working towards them. So considering that physical space where I put myself in a room when I come in, I always sit down. I ask permission to sit down. I ask permission before I come in the room, but I want them to know I am there for them. If I speak to a child, and I model this for every learner who's ever with me, the first time I meet a child, I meet them below eye level always. I want them to know that they are the most important person in this room. And I also intentionally speak to a child who might not be able to communicate back to me, always acknowledging their presence and always saying goodbye to them as well when I leave the room. Process. What is the process that's happening? Is it open-ended? Are there questions for discovery? Is it a conversation, or is there something being delivered and answers being given? It's very transactional. Are you anticipating a right answer as a provider in the room, or as a parent, maybe exploring spirituality with your child? Maybe you want your child to answer you a specific way, especially if it's belief related, right? Like, You know, and I know that many children, and I have my stories, I know folks here have their stories of children asking things like, what happens when we die? Or where am I going to go when I die? And those are the kinds of things where if children anticipate that we have a specific right answer and they may be feeling something different, it's really important that we give them the space to share with us what they're feeling and what they might be exploring. Imagination. This is a strength of childhood, we know. You can watch any child with things that may be there for open-ended play, and you will see their imagination immediately. So always thinking, what are the barriers to imagination? Is it distraction? Is it the space? Sometimes just honestly being sick is a barrier to imagination, which can be hard. I think it's important to acknowledge that too. Relationship. What are the relationships? Children are watching the relationships that parents and caregivers have with the providers. They're watching how providers treat their parents. They're noticing when things are tense. They're noticing if information is not being shared with them. Children are noticing what's happening. They're observant and they're paying attention even when we think they aren't. And so it's really important that not only do we have good relationships as family and parents and also as providers, but also that providers have good relationships with each other, because children are noticing those things too. Intimacy. What is the amount of depth of conversation, and what is the boundary that's happening there too? Am I asking consent before I move into a difficult question? Am I giving people the ability to opt out of that? What am I putting in the medical record? And what do I have permission to put in the medical record? There's some things you have to put without permission, but there's a lot to consider there around intimacy, which also leads to trust. How vulnerable people will be with you is always tried to trust. And these different kinds of knowing and not knowing. Children will trust you more if they feel like you're being honest with them, and if you give them space to be their true and honest self. And that makes me think a lot about a time that I was with a 12-year-old who point blank said to me, I need to know what you believe. And I was like, well, that's not really my job. My job is to learn about what you believe. And she's like, well, I'm not telling you unless you tell me. I was like, well, dang, I've never been told this directly before, given an ultimatum by a 12-year-old. I said, here's the deal. I'll tell you if you promise me you will let it be whatever I share, and then you will share what is true for you, and it does not have to be the same as mine. And she said, yes, that's what I want. And I was like, great, let's go for it. And we did. And so curious, I know we have 6 minutes. I was going to ask Jeanette a question. I want to give it back to Blythe as well. So let me just give this to Blythe and we'll see how the space wraps up for us today.
Well, no, I think we can go a few minutes over. So let's have Jeanette, if you guys are okay, Robin and Amanda and Jeanette. I'm comfortable going, leaving time for questions at the top of the hour. So Jeanette, if you speak to this.
So my question for Jeanette was, when you think back to your experiences in healthcare with Frankie, which of these were most honored? And which did you feel like were really missing or could have been honored more?
Well, I'm going to be truthful here.
Please, yes, that's what we want.
That I absolutely would have not allowed any provider mess with any of these things. That was not a thing I allowed. I created the space. I came in with my son. And as far as I'm concerned, my son was the VIP and all the things that he always wanted in life. There was no change between his bedroom and the hospital room. I would meet the physicians, whether they're nurses, clinicians, whoever came in. I was very direct as to who I was, what I was representing in the room. I wasn't necessarily being mom. I at that time had substituted judgment for Frankie because he couldn't speak for himself. And I literally had legally substituted judgment for him from court. So they literally had to sort of listen to me. And I also said, well, I'm dual personality. I'm mom, but I'm also him. This is what he would want. I, as mom, support that. And I expect you to support that. And if you're not doing that, then get me somebody else that will. So I was very strict about that because Frankie had kind of conversed before when he could talk. He had expressed sort of that fear of being deaf or alone because he was such a social person that was not something that I was going to allow. And I think back, the one time that I had that sort of existential sort of limit that you said was the first when it was at the height of COVID. that Frankie went in to the hospital and everything was sort of shut down and nobody could come in. And I said, they told me, well, you need to, he's not going to survive past tonight. And I said, oh, that's not a thing. His brother's coming in. And that first they didn't want him to come in. And it turned out that they put the little things on his ear to listen. And his brother said, hey, Frankie, what are you doing? You got to wake up. And he literally woke up. He didn't even get intubated that night. And all the providers saw at that moment that what I was saying all along is his brother needs to come in. That was the only time that happened. And after that, he had permission. They actually would cover him up and bring him in through like the side door to kind of come into the ICU to spend time with his brother because they recognized that he needed that. So I was very lucky in the sense that happened because now I had something that I could refer back that people could kind of read into the chart. But I think that the thing that was very important is that the clinicians and myself, we learned to trust each other, which is actually the biggest part of all of it. If we can trust each other, then we can communicate. And I think it would have been really important. Well, it was very important towards the end that everything that I said, I was considered a team member. The process did not happen unless I was part of the process. So I think that when you're looking at the spirit, all of it is actually really important. There's not a piece that it doesn't work. It's actually sort of interconnected. And I think that if clinicians need to, I know that some parents might not have kind of knowledge and sort of could get a little bit lost in their grief of why their child is there. But I think that if we get kind of clear parameters and there's trust, I think there's nothing that we can overcome. And it's getting that space from the clinicians to give us that.
So I hear when Jeanette is describing that, like she was Frankie's proxy, right? So she's the channel. She's the eye contact with not just Frankie, but with Jeanette, like that whole, the intimacy, the relationship, the trust, for those that the parent as proxy for the child is may well be part of that dynamic. It was certainly more in the case of Frankie than David.
And I can give just a very quick example of Jeanette, what you were describing there around space. If I walk up to a room and ask permission to come in and someone invites me in and I notice, oh my goodness, this is set up like this is a sacred space. Like, and I always think that, like, I know some folks will just walk in and sit down on a child's bed. You will never see me do that. My question is always, where's the best place for me to sit? Or can I grab a chair? Is that okay? Would you prefer I stand? Really giving a lot of options and choices because this is, for many families, their home away from home, even if they don't want it to be home. It has become that. I've seen so many families do beautiful things to transform a space to make it theirs. And then I often notice too when the room is not feeling like home, right? When there's things that are missing, like when a family doesn't have access to food or a family doesn't have access to a pillow to sleep on that night or toiletry, like basic needs. Sometimes those things also impact the way we build relationship and trust. And I love the way you talked about the fact that you were a member of that team and that was deeply important to the relationship and trust that you had. That is huge.
Thank you. So I wanted to add, since everybody, and you pointed it out in the beginning, I'm actually in Frankie's room. We haven't changed it. And everything in the back was all sports related. All the walls are covered in sports. And when he was coming in house, they already knew because I always called ahead, we're coming in. And there was always a little tray with paints. And I always painted the children's window. So to make it look like this. So it always felt like Frankie was in the same space, but just in a different area.
Yeah, Frankie had a pretty glorious mama.
Thank you.
Still does. So I'm going to, first of all, Amanda and Robin and Jeanette, thank you so much for that. I love the way that flowed. Going to share two of the questions that were sent in ahead of time. The first is, what questions can be helpful to assess a child's understanding of their own spirituality? Well, you did say that, Amanda, like what makes you special? Like what makes you different from, not special, but what makes you different from all the other children here? Is there anything else there? And then the other question is, and maybe Robin and Jeanette, you have an answer to this also, is what are the hardest or is the hardest question to for you to answer? Because Amanda, you've probably been given quite a few doozies.
Oh, for sure. Let me start with that first question. That's much easier, and I have some thoughts around. So one of the clearest ways I've learned to do this is by operating around those 4 areas we talked about in the relational connection. So the child and self, child and others, child and natural world, child and transcendent or other or something bigger. And so I ask really simple questions like, what makes you special is really my way of asking, who are you? I want to know you. What is important to know about you? Um, what do you want me to know about you today? And maybe that'll change next time I see you. But I want to, and how are you changing? I mean, I think a lot of children in these spaces are changing frequently. And so getting to know them, I often realize I know kids at sometimes their hardest moments, which is also really interesting to know them in this way, right? And parents at their absolute most sleep deprived, exhausted, distressed version of themselves. And so I can also lift up and see their resilience in these moments. Sometimes we can dialogue about who they are together and what I can see reflected as they share. And that's helpful. Who loves you and who do you love? Is
Mm,
how I've learned to ask. What's your
mm,
relationship to other people?
mm,
That's where things like, there's a lot of tools out there that can help you, like, what is your faith? What's your belief? What's your this and that? And I can ask those questions and I generally know when to head that direction. I think that's the specialty skill set of a chaplain. But it will come up in these other 4 areas almost always. So as I'm exploring what's most important to you, usually you will bring these things up if they're top of mind. Otherwise, if I just go to that, I'm suggesting then that my role is just to support your religious belief, that I also may have some idea about what you should feel or think or how you should be using that right now. And then I've completely limited the conversation. So I really start from this broader sense, and then we can hone in on some of those more specific things as they arise.
mm. Uh, can we clone you, Amanda? Amanda, are you willing to share your slides? Okay. We will be sending a follow-up to all of you who registered and are here tonight. Well, if you're here tonight and you are asking for continuing education credits, you will get them. If you registered, you will get a recording of this talk and a link to a recording of this talk. We will also send you Amanda's slides. Amanda, just what in your experience has been the hardest question to answer? Or is there a question you dread?
I don't know if it's a question as much as a situation.
Okay.
I'm like, I can feel it in my body, that feeling when you're like, I'm gonna start crying now. It's when
Mm,
a child is feeling something and their parents will not allow them to express it is the
mm,
hardest feeling in the room.
mm,
And I get where it comes from. Like I have grown in empathy. I used to be very frustrated by it, and now I get it. I remember a precious kindergartner that I cared for, and her parents would let me care for her. They did not want to interact with me. Um, and their belief system did not really provide a lot of space for like they didn't have female clergy in their tradition, and I understood that. But they could see that I maybe would have value to her. And she told me one day that her parents told her that God gave her cancer to bring glory to himself. She's like, and then she just said it like in a passing thought, like, this is why I have cancer. It's for God. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Like, how do I explore this? But I don't want to upset the parents who are in the room, but I don't really have a relationship with them. Like, you're like caught in between this dynamic. And then she would find her way as we would have these conversations. Like, I would hold some open space. We would color, we would read books. We spent a lot of time playing together. And she would share these things that were most important to her as we went. And over time, I was able to explore some of those questions with her and learn that she saw God and her world as ultimately good. And I did ask her, I'm trying to think how I asked it. How do you think God feels about you having cancer? I think that was the way that I found to explore that later in a different moment.
mm,
And she said, I think God is really sad that I am sick and he wished I wasn't
mm,
sick.
mm.
And my goal there was not to undermine parents. They also never told her that she was dying. She knew she was dying. She had a strong sense about it. Again, I get that choice, and I never want to add judgment to that choice. But I have sat with children um, who've wondered specific things about their dying young children, and when their parents weren't in the room, been able to finally say, like, what's it going to feel like when I die? And that's not something that then I have that conversation without the parent. I say, how can we bring that conversation to your mom and dad? How can we ask that question of the doctors in the room? Like, how can I help you be able to have the courage to have those conversations and then to be there to support everyone? So it's really, I think of my job as holding a container that everybody can be within, and I'll hold the burden of it. That can be my gift to the room. I'll hold that container.
Yeah. First of all, that is, I think, to do this work, the work that you do, that chaplains do, that palliative care does, any role that is not the parental role, to have to tolerate it and navigate it, is obviously very difficult, but you understand that that is part of the job. Parents, of course, it's part of the job, but they're not trained to do it. And at Courageous Parents Network, we do want to equip parents as much as possible to be able to, I'm not specific to that particular parent couple instance, your example, but saying, I want to be able to stay in the room and tolerate a question that on the inside, I'm quite certain I will break apart. If I have to hear this question, maybe I'm going to die just hearing the question. But I have to be able to have my child hear it. I mean, express it and not silence them. And we do have some, one of the families we've interviewed for CPN, she was on here earlier, I don't know if she's still here, is Amy Graver, who talks about how she and her daughter's palliative care doctor worked together to allow her daughter to express her fears and worries. And the mother and father were there with the palliative care doctor, and the palliative care doctor, the three of them did that together, but I'm fairly certain the parents were only able to do it because they were not alone. They had the palliative care doctor there with them, with the trust and all of that. So whether it's a palliative care clinician or a chaplain or a therapist, it doesn't matter, psychologist, who the person is, just somebody to hold your hand, mom and dad, so that you don't fear that you can't, so you have somebody to help you do this very, very difficult thing. Because as Robin, the example she gave with David needed to unburden himself. And if he'd been at home and not in the hospital with a clinician there who went in there for 3 hours, what would David have needed at home? And by the way, we as parents know when we're not allowing something that is trying to come out. We know when we're stifling stuff, and that doesn't feel good either. So it's like, so it's in everyone's best interest, but it takes a lot of courage, and it takes guidance. It takes guidance. So thank God we can lean on professionals like Amanda to ask for that guidance. Okay, I'm sorry we don't have more time. I haven't even looked at this chat to see what all the other things are, but maybe we will look at the chat, and if there's anything that seems maybe actually, Amanda, I'm going to send you, with your permission, send you the chat. And if there are questions in there that you can quickly answer and then send back to us, we can also send that out with the follow-up email. And the follow-up email will also include links to resources on Courageous Parents Network to help you do this beautiful, difficult, brave work. Robin, Jeanette, Amanda, thank you. And all of you who are here, parents, clinicians, extended family, thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you do. I think it's a beautiful thing that so many of you were interested in this topic. Thank goodness.